The body cam footage would eventually be viewed by millions, but on that rainy Tuesday, only 2 men knew the truth. They thought they had just taken down a threat. They thought the man walking into the hospital waiting room was just another helpless, angry father they could intimidate into silence. They were wrong. They didn't know that the girl fighting for her life was the daughter of the one man the FBI calls when they need to hunt down corrupt officers. They fired a bullet into silence, but the echo was about to shatter their entire lives. This is how justice strikes back. The rain in Seattle didn't make a sound for Aria. It was just a sensation, a cold, rhythmic tapping against her skin, a vibration through the soles of her sneakers as they slapped against the wet pavement. At 16, Aria Sterling existed in a world of profound, peaceful silence. She adjusted the strap of her backpack, heavy with library books. She had stayed late to finish her history paper, and now the twilight was deepening into a bruised purple over the suburbs. She signed a song to herself, her fingers moving deftly in the pockets of her hoodie. Left, then right, then home. 2 blocks away, Patrol Unit 402 sat idling in the shadow of an oak tree. Inside, Officer Brett Reynolds drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, agitated. He had been on the force for 6 years, and his file was a thick stack of excessive force complaints that had all miraculously vanished thanks to the police union and a sympathetic chief. Beside him was the rookie, Officer Clint Harrow. Harrow was skittish, desperate to impress Reynolds, whom he viewed as a street-hardened veteran. "Quiet night," Harrow muttered. "Too quiet," Reynolds grunted, his eyes scanning the street. He spotted a figure in a hoodie, walking briskly down the sidewalk. "There, fits the description." "What description?" Harrow asked, confused. Dispatch said the suspect was a 6-foot male in a grey jacket. That looks like a girl in a blue hoodie. "Suspects change clothes, Harrow. Don't be naive. Look at the way she's walking. Ignoring us. Suspicious." Reynolds threw the cruiser into gear and peeled out, tires screeching against the wet asphalt. Aria didn't hear the siren chirp. She didn't hear the tires squeal. She was thinking about her dad, David, who promised to make lasagna tonight. She kept walking, her eyes on the cracks in the sidewalk. The cruiser mounted the curb, cutting off her path. The sudden flash of blue and red lights against the wet concrete made Aria jump. She looked up, eyes wide, heart hammering. She saw 2 men jumping out of the car. Their mouths were moving aggressively. She froze. Her hands went up instinctively, palms open. She tried to sign, "I am deaf. I cannot hear you." "Get your hands where I can see them," Reynolds screamed, his hand already hovering over his holster. Aria's hands were up, but she moved one hand toward her ear to signal she couldn't hear. "She's reaching," Reynolds roared. "Drop it! Drop the weapon!" "Sarge, I don't see her," Harrow started, but the adrenaline of his superior officer was infectious. Aria looked confused. She saw the anger in the older officer's face. She took a terrified step back, her hand moving to her pocket to retrieve her phone, to type out a message. "I'm deaf." "Gun," Reynolds yelled, though there was nothing but a pink phone case. Bang! The shot wasn't loud to Aria. It was a sudden, violent shove against her shoulder. The world tilted sideways. The grey sky spun. She hit the wet grass, the vibration of her own body hitting the ground, shuddering through her bones. She looked at the sky, confused why her shoulder felt like it was burning with a white-hot iron. Reynolds stood over her, gun smoking. He kicked the phone away from her hand. "Secure the suspect!" He barked at Harrow. Harrow rushed forward, looking at the girl. She was writhing, clutching her shoulder, blood seeping through the blue hoodie. He looked at the phone lying in the grass. Then he looked at her face. She was mouthing words, tears streaming down her face, making frantic signs with her one good hand. "Dad! Help! Pain! Sarge!" Harrow's voice trembled. "It's a phone, it's just a phone." Reynolds's face went pale, then hardened into a mask of cruel calculation. He holstered his weapon and looked around. The street was empty. No witnesses, just the rain. "It's whatever I say it is, Harrow," Reynolds hissed. He reached into his ankle holster and pulled out a small, untraceable switchblade. He dropped it next to Araya's trembling hand. "Sarge, you can't. She's a kid," Harrow whispered, horrified. "She's a suspect who attacked an officer," Reynolds said, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "And unless you want to be an accessory to a shooting investigation that ends your career before it starts, you saw the knife. You saw her lunge. Did you see it, Harrow?" Harrow looked at the girl, bleeding and silent, her eyes rolling back. He looked at Reynolds. I saw it," Harrow whispered, selling his soul in the rain. The waiting room of St. Jude's Medical Center was awash of sterile white lights and the smell of antiseptic. Officer Reynolds stood by the vending machine, sipping a lukewarm coffee. He had already briefed the chief. The story was set. Suspect acted erratically, refused commands, reached for a deadly weapon. Officer discharged weapon in self-defense. It was a script Reynolds had rehearsed before. He felt no guilt, only the annoyance of paperwork. Harrow sat in a plastic chair, his leg bouncing nervously. What if she wakes up? What if she talks? "She's deaf, genius. We found her medical ID in the bag," Reynolds scoffed. "Who's a jury going to believe? A decorated veteran and a police officer, or a confused, disabled teenager who was walking through a high-crime area at night? We control the narrative." At that moment, the automatic doors slid open. A man walked in. He was tall, wearing a soaked grey trench coat over a simple suit. He didn't run. He didn't scream. He walked with a terrifying rhythmic precision. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes, dark, sharp, and intelligent, burned with a cold fire. This was David Sterling. He walked straight to the reception desk. The nurse looked up, startled by his intensity. "Arya Sterling," he said. His voice was low, baritone, and steady. She was brought in with a gunshot wound. "Sir, are you family?" "I am her father," Reynolds nudged Harrow. "Showtime. Let's nip this in the bud." Reynolds strode over, hitching his belt up, expanding his chest to look as imposing as possible. He intercepted David before he could get the room number. "Mr. Sterling," Reynolds said, his voice booming with fake authority. "I'm Officer Reynolds. I'm the one who was forced to engage your daughter." David stopped. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Reynolds' badge number. 429-022. He memorized it instantly. Then he looked at Reynolds' face. He didn't blink. "Engage," David repeated. The word hung in the air like a guillotine blade. "She failed to comply with lawful orders," Reynolds said, crossing his arms. "She produced a weapon, a knife. I had no choice but to neutralize the threat. You should be grateful I aimed for the shoulder. Most guys would have aimed center mass." David's expression didn't change, but the air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. He looked at Harrow, who couldn't meet his eyes and was staring at the floor. "A knife," David said flatly. "My daughter, who has been deaf since birth and carries nothing but books and a cell phone, pulled a knife on 2 armed officers. We recovered it at the scene. It's in evidence," Reynolds said, smirking slightly. "Look, I know you're upset. Bad parenting leads to bad situations. Maybe teach her to listen next time." It was a taunt designed to provoke a reaction. Reynolds wanted David to yell, to swing, to cause a scene so they could arrest him and discredit the family further. But David didn't swing. He took a slow breath. He reached into his coat pocket. Reynolds' hand twitched toward his gun. David pulled out a pair of reading glasses and a small leather notebook. He opened it and wrote down the time, the location, and Reynolds' name. "What are you doing?" Reynolds demanded, unnerved by the lack of screaming. "Documenting the moment you confessed to a felony," David said calmly. He closed the notebook and pocketed it. "I am going to see my daughter now. Do not speak to me again. If you come within 10 feet of her room, I will consider it a threat to her life, and I will respond accordingly." "You threatening a police officer?" Reynolds stepped forward, getting in David's face. David leaned in, his voice a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. "I'm not threatening you, Officer Reynolds. I'm educating you. There is a difference between a victim and a target. You just made the mistake of turning a victim into a target. Now get out of my way." Reynolds, for the first time in his career, felt a primal spike of fear. He stepped back. David walked past him, his coat billowing slightly, heading toward the ICU. "Who does he think he is?" Harrow whispered. "Nobody," Reynolds spat, though his hands were shaking slightly. "Just another angry dad. We stick to the story. The chief has our back." Inside the ICU room, the only sound was the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. Aria lay pale against the white sheets, her shoulder heavily bandaged. She was sedated, but her brow was furrowed in pain. David sat beside her. He took her hand, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. The rage inside him was a physical thing, a black oil filling his lungs, but he pushed it down. He needed clarity. He needed the cold, analytical mind that had served him for 20 years. He checked his watch. 9:45 p.m. He pulled out his phone. It wasn't a standard smartphone. It was a secure, encrypted device issued by the Bureau. He dialed a number that very few people possessed. It rang once. "Director Vance!" A gruff voice answered. "It's Sterling," David said. There was a pause on the other end. "David, you've been on leave for 6 months. I didn't expect to hear from you until the terrifying silence of retirement drove you back. I need a team, Vance. Tonight." The tone of the director shifted instantly from casual to command. "What happened?" "Local PD in Seattle shot my daughter." "Is she?" "She's alive. They planted a knife. Officer Brett Reynolds and Officer Clint Harrow. They are running a cover-up. The chief will likely bury the body cam footage or edit it by morning." "I can have a team there in 4 hours," Vance said. "But David, you know the protocol. If it's personal, you can't run the case." "It's not personal, Vance. It's a civil rights violation involving the falsification of evidence and attempted murder of a disabled minor," David lied smoothly. It was entirely personal. It was the most personal thing he had ever done. "I want the CRU, Civil Rights Unit. I want forensics, and I want their internal comms seized. I'll send Agent Miller and Agent Kovac. They're the best pit bulls I have. David, don't do anything that puts you in cuffs before we get there." "I can't promise that," David said, and hung up. He looked back at Aria. Her eyes fluttered open. She looked at him, confused, terrified. She tried to sign, but her arm was immobilized. She whimpered. David leaned in, making sure she could see his lips. He signed with his hands, slow and deliberate. "You are safe. I am here." She blinked, tears leaking out. "They shot me, Daddy. I didn't do anything." "I know," he signed back. "I know." There was a commotion in the hallway. David stood up and moved to the door. He cracked it open. Outside, the chief of police, Chief Gordon Hayes, was talking to Reynolds. Hayes was a heavy-set man who had built a career on making problems disappear. "You're sure the knife was there?" Hayes asked in a hushed tone. 100%, Chief. Her fingerprints are on it." Reynolds lied. He had pressed Aria's unconscious fingers to the hilt before the ambulance arrived. Good. We're releasing a statement to the press in an hour. Officer involved shooting. Armed suspect. We'll paint her as troubled. School records. Anything you can find. Smear her before the public gets sympathetic. David listened, his jaw tightening until his teeth creaked. They weren't just content with shooting her. They were going to destroy her reputation to save their pensions. He closed the door silently. He walked back to the chair and sat down. He wasn't going to yell at them. He wasn't going to fight them in the hallway. He opened his notebook again. Target 1, Reynolds. Target 2, Harrow. Target 3, Chief Hayes. He began to draft a plan. It wasn't a legal defense. It was a demolition. He didn't just want them fired. He wanted them to lose everything. He wanted the world to see them for exactly what they were. David took a picture of Aria's hand, bruised and battered, resting on the sheet. He didn't post it to social media. He sent it to a private contact named The Wolf, an independent journalist with 5 million subscribers who specialized in exposing corruption. The text message read, "I have the story of the year. But you wait for my signal. When this drops, I want it to bury them." David Sterling sat back and waited for the FBI to land. The wolves were at the door, but they didn't realize the lion was already inside. The clock on the wall of the precinct ticked past midnight, but the lights in Chief Gordon Hayes's office were blazing. The chief sat behind his mahogany desk, a half-eaten donut on a napkin and a bottle of antacids next to his keyboard. Across from him, Officer Reynolds looked relaxed, his feet propped up on a chair. Rookie Officer Harrow was pacing near the window, peering through the blinds at the wet, empty street below. "The statement is out," Hayes grunted, hitting send on his email. Suspect identified as Aria Sterling, 16. History of behavioral issues suspected. We didn't find any behavioral issues in her school file, but suspected is a legally safe word. It paints the picture. Reynolds chuckled. Nice touch, Chief. The public hates a unruly teenager. By the time the truth tries to put its boots on, we'll be heroes who stopped a potential stabbing. I don't like it, Harrow muttered, turning from the window. Her dad. He wasn't normal. The way he looked at us. He took notes, Sarge. Who takes notes when their kid just got shot? A man who knows he's helpless, Reynolds scoffed. Sit down, Harrow. You're making me dizzy. We have the knife. We have your statement. My statement. It's ironclad. We just need to scrub the audio from the first 30 seconds of the body cam footage, the part where she might have tried to say something. We'll claim the audio malfunctioned due to rain damage. Hayes nodded. Tech is working on it now. It'll be erased in 10 minutes. The intercom on Hayes's desk buzzed. Chief, you have visitors. Hayes frowned. At midnight. Tell the press to wait for the morning briefing. It's not the press, Chief. It's a lot of SUVs. Black ones. The desk sergeant's voice cracked. Before Hayes could respond, the heavy oak door to his office didn't just open. It was thrown wide with enough force to rattle the framed commendations on the wall. 2 figures stepped in. They didn't look like local cops. They wore crisp, tailored suits that cost more than Reynolds made in a month. The first was Special Agent Miller, a woman with eyes like flint and a posture that screamed military background. The second was Agent Kovac, a man built like a linebacker with a tablet tucked under his arm. Behind them, filling the bullpen, were a dozen FBI agents in windbreakers marked Evidence Response Team. What the hell is this? Hayes stood up, his face reddening. This is my station. You can't just barge in here. Agent Miller didn't even blink. She walked straight to the desk and slammed a piece of paper down on top of the chief's donut. Federal warrant, Miller said, her voice crisp and cold. Authorized by the Department of Justice. We are seizing all servers, all physical evidence, and all personnel files related to case Mlodasharwa 4292 involving Arya Sterling. On what grounds? Reynolds demanded, standing up and dropping his hand to his belt out of habit. Kovac stepped forward, towering over Reynolds. Keep your hand away from that weapon, officer, unless you want to add assaulting a federal agent to your list of problems tonight. This is jurisdiction overreach, Hayes sputtered. It's a local shooting. Not anymore, a voice came from the doorway. David Sterling walked in. He had changed out of his wet clothes into a fresh suit, but his eyes were the same terrifying voids of calm rage. He walked into the chief's office as if he owned the building. He stopped in front of Reynolds. You missed a spot, David said softly, pointing to Reynolds' collar. There was a tiny speck of dried blood. Arya's blood. Reynolds swallowed hard. Who are you? I'm the man who audited the cartel task force in 2009, David said. I'm the man who put the district attorney of Chicago in federal prison for racketeering. And now, I'm the man who is going to ensure you never wear a badge again. David turned to Agent Miller. Miller, secure the IT room. They were about to scrub the body cam audio. If that file is touched, arrest the chief for obstruction of justice immediately. Already on it, sir, Miller nodded. Team Alpha is at the server banks now. Hayes slumped back in his chair, his face draining of color. He looked at David, really looked at him for the first time. He realized the mistake they had made wasn't just tactical, it was fatal. They had poked a sleeping dragon. Harrow, David said, turning his gaze to the rookie. Harrow jumped, his back hitting the window. I didn't shoot. I didn't shoot her. But you watched, David said. And you lied. Agent Kovac, take Officer Harrow to interview room 1. Separate him from the others. No phones, no union rep until he is processed. You can't do that, Reynolds shouted. He has rights. He has the right to remain silent, David said, his voice dropping to a whisper that echoed in the silent office. And I suggest he uses it. Because if he lies to a federal agent, he's looking at 20 years. As the FBI agents began to swarm the office, boxing up files and seizing computers, David leaned in close to Reynolds. You wanted a narrative, Reynolds? You wanted a story? I'm writing it now. And the ending isn't going to be what you expected. The interrogation room was cold. A single metal table was bolted to the floor. Officer Clint Harrow sat on one side, his hands trembling on the table. He was 22 years old. He had joined the force to help people. He had wanted to be a hero. Now, he was sweating through his uniform in front of a man who looked like he could dismantle a bomb with his teeth. David Sterling didn't sit. He stood in the corner, in the shadows. Agent Miller sat at the table, a file open in front of her. Officer Harrow, Miller began, her tone surprisingly gentle. We have the preliminary forensics on the knife found at the scene. It's a standard switchblade. Cheap. Untraceable. Harrow said nothing. He stared at his hands. The interesting thing about fingerprints, Miller continued, tapping a photo on the file, is how they are placed. When someone grabs a knife to attack, they grip it hard. The prints are smeared, overlapping, forceful. She slid the photo across the table. It showed the knife handle with black dust powder highlighting the prints. These prints, Miller said, they are perfect, delicate, almost placed, like someone took a sleeping girl's hand and gently pressed her fingers against the metal. Harrow squeezed his eyes shut. A tear leaked out. From the shadows, David spoke. She was signing, Clint. Harrow's head snapped up. My daughter, David said, stepping into the light. She wasn't reaching for a weapon. She was signing. She was telling you she was deaf. She was begging for help. I told him, Harrow whispered, his voice cracking. I told him it was a phone. Speak up, Miller said sharply. I told him, Harrow yelled, slamming his hand on the table. I saw the phone. I told Reynolds it wasn't a gun. But he fired anyway. He just wanted to shoot. He was angry at the world, and he took it out on her. And the knife? David asked. He carries it in his ankle holster, Harrow sobbed. A throwdown piece. He told me if I didn't back him up, my career was over. He said the union would bury me. He said I'd be the one going to jail because I was the partner. David looked at Miller. She nodded. They had the confession. But David wasn't done. He needed the public to see this. He needed to burn the corruption out, root and stem. We have his confession recorded, Miller said. We can arrest Reynolds now. Not yet, David said. Arresting him isn't enough. If we arrest him now, the union spins it. Rogue rookie lies to save himself. We need Reynolds to hang himself. David pulled out his phone. He had a notification from The Wolf. Video is ready. 5.2 million views in the first hour. It's trending globally. David showed the screen to Harrow. It was a video montage. It started with a photo of Aria, smiling with her hearing aids visible, holding a debate trophy. Then it cut to the grainy security footage from a nearby ATM that the Wolf had obtained. It wasn't the body cam footage, it was a third-party angle. It showed Aria walking. It showed the cruiser swerve onto the curb aggressively. It showed her hands go up. It showed the shot. And most damning of all, it showed Reynolds kicking the phone away and planting the knife while Harrow looked on in horror. The world is watching, Clint, David said. Reynolds is finished. The chief is finished. The only question is, are you going down as the villain or the witness? I'll testify, Harrow wept. I'll tell them everything. Just, don't let him near me. David walked out of the interrogation room. The hallway of the precinct was chaotic. Agents were carrying boxes. But the real chaos was outside. Through the front glass doors, David could see the crowd gathering. It was 2 a.m., but the street was packed. People had seen the video. They were holding signs. They were chanting Aria's name. The news vans had arrived, their satellite dishes extended like antennas of judgment. Reynolds was standing by the coffee machine, looking at his phone, his face pale as a sheet. He had seen the video. He looked up and saw David standing across the room. David didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just held up his phone, showing the live feed of the protest outside. Karma, David thought. It doesn't always wait for the next life. Reynolds dropped his coffee cup. It shattered on the floor, brown liquid splashing over his polished boots. He turned to run toward the back exit, but Agent Kovac was already there, arms crossed, blocking the way. Going somewhere, officer? Kovac asked. Reynolds turned back. David was walking toward him, holding a pair of handcuffs. These aren't mine, David said, tossing the cuffs to Reynolds. They're yours. Put them on. You can't, Reynolds stammered. Put them on. David's voice was a thunderclap. Reynolds looked at the agents surrounding him. He looked at the chief, who was being led out of his office in handcuffs by Miller. He looked at the window, where the flashing lights of the press illuminated his failure. Trembling, Reynolds picked up the cuffs. He clicked one onto his left wrist, then his right. David stepped closer. You took her silence for weakness. Now, you're going to have a long time in a quiet cell to think about that. He signaled to Kovac. Read him his rights, then walk him out the front door. The press wants a picture. As Kovac dragged the disgraced officer toward the front doors, toward the blinding flash of cameras and the roar of the angry crowd, David turned away. He didn't care about the spectacle. He had a promise to keep. He walked out the back door, into the cool night rain. He had to go back to the hospital. He had to be there when Arya woke up. He had to tell her that the monsters were gone. But the war wasn't over. The trial was coming, and David knew that a wounded animal fights hardest when it's cornered. The union lawyers were already mobilizing. This was just the first battle. 6 months later, the King County Superior Court had transformed into a battleground. An oppressive, humid heatwave had settled over Seattle, sticking shirts to backs and fraying tempers. But inside courtroom 4B, the air conditioning was cranked so high it felt like a meat locker. The atmosphere was brittle, ready to snap. The trial of the state versus Brett Reynolds had become more than a legal proceeding. It was a national referendum on power. Every wooden bench in the gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder. Reporters from every major network jostled for space in the designated media box, their laptops glowing like fireflies. Outside the heavy double doors, the muffled chant of thousands of supporters could be heard through the stone walls, a rhythmic, thumping cadence. Hands up, voice off. Hands up, voice off. Arya Sterling sat in the front row, directly behind the prosecution table. She wore a simple white dress that stood in stark contrast to the sea of grey and black suits around her. Her arm was out of the sling, and physically she had healed. But the psychological scar was visible in the way she held herself. Too still, her eyes darting toward the exits whenever a door opened too loudly. Beside her sat David. He was statue still, his face a mask of granite. He wasn't the lead prosecutor. That role belonged to District Attorney Sarah Jenkins, a sharp-witted woman with a reputation for being a shark in heels. But everyone in the room knew David was the engine driving this machine. He had spent the last 6 months in a war room, analyzing every piece of evidence, every precedent, and every potential lie the defense would spin. He wasn't just a father today. He was a hunter, waiting for the trap to spring. The defense attorney, Richard Davenport, stood to address the jury. Davenport was the kind of lawyer who cost $1,000 an hour and looked it. His suit was Italian silk, his tan was perfect, and his smile was disarming. He had been hired by the Fraternal Order of Police to make this nightmare disappear. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Davenport began, his voice smooth and baritone, pacing deliberately before the jury box. "We are not here to judge a villain. We are here to judge a human being. Officer Brett Reynolds is a father, a husband, and a decorated veteran who has served this city for 10 years. Davenport stopped and pointed dramatically at Reynolds, who sat at the defense table with his head bowed. Reynolds had lost weight. He wore a slightly ill-fitting suit and glasses, a calculated attempt to look like a harmless accountant rather than a street cop. "On that rainy night," Davenport continued, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, "Officer Reynolds didn't see a teenage girl. He saw a shadowy figure in a high-crime neighborhood. He saw non-compliance. He saw a suspect reach for a metallic object in the dark. In that split second, with adrenaline flooding his system, his training kicked in. He didn't fire out of malice. He fired out of fear. Fear for his life and fear for the life of his partner. Ask yourselves, if you were in the dark, in the rain, facing a potential threat, would you have waited to see the muzzle flash before you defended yourself?" It was a compelling narrative. David watched the jury. 2 of them, a middle-aged woman in a floral blouse and an older man with crossed arms, nodded slightly. Davenport was good. He was painting Reynolds as the victim of circumstance. "The prosecution wants you to believe this was a cold-blooded act," Davenport concluded, resting his hands on the railing. "But they have no proof of malice, only tragedy, and you cannot send a man to prison for a tragedy." D.A. Jenkins didn't flinch. She stood up as Davenport sat down. She didn't offer a grandiose speech. She simply adjusted her glasses and looked at the bailiff. The state calls Clint Harrow. A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom. This was the wild card. The blue wall of silence was legendary. Cops rarely testified against their own. The side door opened and Clint Harrow walked in. He looked like a ghost. He was 23 but looked 40. Dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes, and his hands shook as he took the oath. He avoided looking at Reynolds, who was staring at him with a gaze that promised violence. "Mr. Harrow," Jenkins began, her tone clinical. "You were Officer Reynolds' partner on the night of November 14th. Tell the jury what happened." Harrow cleared his throat, but no sound came out. He took a sip of water, his hand trembling so hard the glass clicked against his teeth. "We were on patrol," Harrow said, his voice a rasp. Officer Reynolds was agitated. He said he was bored. He said the streets were too quiet." "Did you receive a dispatch call about a suspect matching Aria Sterling's description?" Jenkins asked. "No," Harrow said softly. "There was no call. He just saw her walking. He said she looked arrogant because she didn't turn around when we drove up." "What happened when you exited the vehicle?" Harrow closed his eyes. The memory seemed to physically pain him. She put her hands up, immediately, palms open. She looked terrified. Reynolds was screaming at her to get on the ground, but she wasn't moving. She was just looking at us, confused. "Did you perceive a threat?" "No," Harrow whispered. "I saw her hand move to her ear. I've seen that gesture before. My cousin is deaf. It clicked in my head. I yelled, 'Sarge, she can't hear you.'" "Did Officer Reynolds acknowledge you?" "He ignored me. He just kept screaming, 'Drop it.' When she reached for her pocket, I saw the pink case. It was bright pink against the dark hoodie. I screamed, 'Phone! It's a phone!'" The jury was leaning in now. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. "And then?" Jenkins pressed. "He fired," Harrow said, tears spilling onto his cheeks. "He didn't hesitate, and after she fell, he didn't call EMS. He walked over and kicked the phone into the gutter. He pulled a drop knife from his ankle holster. He told me to touch it. He said, 'If you don't put your prints on this, you're going down with me, kid.'" Harrow looked up, finally meeting Reynolds' eyes. "He made me an accessory to a crime I tried to stop." Reynolds slammed his fist on the table. "Liar! He's a lying traitor!" "Order!" Judge Patterson banged her gavel, her face stern. "Counsel, control your client or I will have him removed." Davenport jumped up for the cross-examination, desperate to salvage the moment. He spent 20 minutes badgering Harrow, accusing him of making a deal with the FBI to save his own skin, calling him a coward who broke under pressure. Harrow wept, but he stuck to his story. But David knew that testimony wasn't enough. It was one man's word against another's. He needed the nail in the coffin. "The state calls Dr. Aris Thorne," Jenkins announced. Dr. Thorne was a man of science, precise and unemotional. He worked for the FBI's audio forensics unit. He set up a laptop and connected it to the courtroom's speaker system. "Dr. Thorne," Jenkins asked, "the defense has argued that the body cam audio was corrupted by water damage and is therefore inadmissible, unusable. Is that correct?" "The file was damaged, yes," Thorne replied, his voice dry. "However, sound waves leave a digital footprint even when the primary track is obscured by static. Using the Bureau's spectral isolation algorithms, we were able to strip away the rain noise and the static interference to recover the dialogue from the 5 seconds preceding the gunshot." Davenport stood up. "Objection. This is manufactured evidence." "Overruled," the judge said sharply. "The methodology has been peer-reviewed. Proceed, doctor." Thorne pressed a key on his laptop. "This is the raw audio." A hiss of static filled the room, unintelligible noise. "And this," Thorne said, "is the isolated vocal track." The courtroom went deathly silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause. First, Harrow's voice, panicked and high-pitched. "Sarge, she's deaf. It's a phone. Don't do it." Then, a pause. A heartbeat of time where a decision was made. Then, Reynolds's voice cut through the silence. It wasn't fearful. It wasn't panicked. It was cold, dismissive, and dripping with contempt. "I don't care." Bang! The gunshot on the recording was deafening in the silent room. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. The jury looked at Reynolds with open horror. The fear for his life defense had just evaporated. He hadn't fired because he was scared. He had fired because he didn't care. He had fired because he viewed Arya not as a person, but as a target he had permission to destroy. Reynolds sank into his chair, his face turning the color of ash. He looked at Davenport, but the lawyer was busy organizing his papers, distancing himself from the radioactive client beside him. David didn't smile. He didn't cheer. He simply reached over the barrier and placed his hand on Arya's shoulder. She looked at him, her eyes wide. She hadn't heard the recording, but she felt the vibration of the room changing. She saw the faces of the jury hardening into stone. She signed one word to her father. "Truth?" David nodded, his eyes locked on Reynolds. "Truth." The game was over. The verdict was now just a formality. The wolf had come to the door, and he hadn't just blown the house down. He had exposed the rot in the foundation for the whole world to see. The day of the sentencing arrived with a heavy, grey sky that seemed to press down on the city of Seattle. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was funereal. The frenetic energy of the trial had evaporated, replaced by the grim certainty of judgment. Brett Reynolds stood before Judge Patterson. The transformation was total. The arrogant officer who had sneered at a bleeding girl in the rain was gone. In his place stood a man in an orange jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists and ankles. His hair was thinning, his skin pasty from weeks in county lockup. He trembled visibly, the chains rattling with a soft, metallic chink-chink that echoed in the silent room. Judge Patterson adjusted her glasses, peering down from the bench like a deity of old. She didn't look at the lawyers. She looked directly at Reynolds. "Mr. Reynolds," she began, her voice devoid of warmth. "In my 20 years on the bench, I have seen crimes of passion, crimes of desperation, and crimes of greed. But what you did, that was a crime of arrogance." She picked up the sentencing report, the paper crinkling loudly. "You were given authority by the state. You were given a weapon. And you used them to hunt a child because you were bored. You saw a disability and mistook it for defiance. And when you realized your mistake, you didn't try to save her life. You tried to end her reputation, to save your career." Reynolds looked down at his feet. A sob escaped his throat, raw and pathetic. "Please, Your Honor," he whispered. "I have a family." "So does Arya Sterling," Patterson snapped. "The difference is, you tried to bury hers." She slammed the gavel down, the sound like a gunshot. "On the charge of attempted murder in the second degree, I sentence you to 25 years. On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, 10 years. On the charges of obstruction of justice and perjury, 5 years each." The courtroom held its breath. "These sentences are to run consecutively," Patterson declared. "You are sentenced to a total of 45 years in a federal penitentiary. You will be eligible for parole when you are 82 years old. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court has none." Reynolds's knees gave way. He collapsed into the chair, wailing. It was an ugly sound, the sound of a man realizing his life was over. His lawyer didn't comfort him. The bailiffs moved in, hauling him up by his armpits like a sack of garbage. As they dragged him toward the side door, Reynolds looked back. He scanned the room, eyes wide with panic. He saw his wife's seat, empty. She had filed for divorce the day the audio recording was played. He saw the police union reps, gone. They had cut him loose to save their public image. Then his eyes locked on David Sterling. David didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply stood there, one hand resting on Aria's shoulder, watching the disposal of a pest. He held Reynolds' gaze until the door slammed shut, severing the connection forever. Karma, however, was just getting started. 2 weeks later, Reynolds was processed into USP Victorville, a high-security federal prison. Because he was a former cop, he was a target. The general population would have killed him in an hour. So, the warden placed him in administrative segregation, ADSEG, the hole. His world was now a 6x9 concrete box, no window, a steel toilet, a thin mattress. The irony was cruel and absolute. Reynolds had hated Aria's silence. He had been offended by it. Now, silence was his only companion. For 23 hours a day, there was no sound but the buzzing of the fluorescent light and his own breathing. When he was allowed out for his 1 hour of recreation, it was in a solitary cage, in a small concrete yard. He couldn't see the sky, only the high walls and the guard towers. During his first month, a package arrived. It was from his former precinct. Reynolds tore it open with trembling hands, hoping for a letter of support, maybe some money for the commissary. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a photocopy of the department's newsletter. On the front page was a photo of a new training center being dedicated. The headline read, "The Aria Sterling Center for De-Escalation Training." Reynolds crumbled the paper, screaming until his throat bled. Nobody came. Nobody cared. He was a ghost in a concrete machine, destined to rot in the quiet dark he had tried to force upon a girl. The shockwaves of David's crusade didn't stop with Reynolds. Chief Gordon Hayes, the man who had tried to bury the body cam footage, thought he could retire quietly. He was wrong. David had forwarded the internal emails seized by the FBI to the city council and the press. Hayes was indicted on federal corruption charges. The city stripped him of his pension, a $1.2 million retirement fund he had been counting on. His assets were frozen to pay for the civil lawsuits. 6 months later, a local news crew did a "Where Are They Now?" segment. They found Hayes working the night shift at a landfill security gate. The former chief of police, who used to dine with mayors, was now checking trucks for illegal dumping at 3 a.m., wearing a vest that was 2 sizes too small. When the reporter approached him, Hayes hid his face and locked the booth door. And Clint Harrow? The rookie who watched? His fate was different. Because of his testimony, he avoided prison. He received 3 years of probation, but he could never be a police officer again. The badge was gone. Harrow took a job as an EMT. He spent his days in the back of an ambulance, trying to save lives, trying to wash the blood off his hands with good deeds. He sent a letter to Aria every year on the anniversary of the shooting. He never asked for forgiveness. He just reported what he was doing to be better. Aria never replied, but she kept the letters. They were a reminder that even in the darkest systems, a crack of light can sometimes get through. A year had passed. The rain in Seattle was gone, replaced by a crisp, golden autumn. David Sterling stood on the balcony of a new building in downtown Seattle. The sign out front read, "The Sterling Foundation, Advocacy and Justice for the Deaf." The civil suit against the city had been settled for $18 million. David hadn't kept a dime. It had all gone here. The foundation provided free legal counsel for deaf citizens, supplied high-tech hearing aids to low-income families, and funded a mandatory training program for law enforcement across the state. The glass doors slid open, and Aria walked out. She looked radiant. She was finishing her senior year of high school and had just been accepted into a pre-law program at Stanford. She walked up to her father and leaned against the railing, looking out at the city that had once tried to kill her. "You thinking about the past?" She signed, her movements fluid and fast. David looked at her. The anger that had fueled him for so long, the black oil in his chest, was finally gone. In its place was a quiet, steady pride. "No," he signed back. "I'm thinking about the future. Your future." Aria smiled. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small velvet box. She handed it to him. "I got you a retirement gift," she signed. David opened the box. Inside was a silver watch. On the back, an inscription was engraved: "To the wolf who guarded the lamb. Time to rest." David chuckled, a rare, genuine sound. He took off his old tactical watch, the one that had timed raids and stakeouts, and put on the silver one. "Rest," he said aloud, testing the word. "I could get used to that." His phone buzzed in his pocket. Not his personal phone, the black encrypted burner he kept for emergencies. Aria saw him stiffen. She looked at the pocket. She knew. "Answer it," she signed. "The world still has monsters." David hesitated, then pulled out the phone. He answered. "Sterling." "David," the voice of FBI Director Vance crackled on the line. "We have a situation. A trafficking ring operating out of a foster care system in Miami. Local PD is compromised. We can't trust anyone down there." David looked at the skyline. He looked at his daughter, who was nodding at him, giving him permission to be who he was. "How bad?" David asked. "Bad. 20 kids missing. We need a ghost, David. We need someone to go in and burn it down." David closed the velvet box and slipped it into his pocket. He looked at Aria. She made a sign. "Go. I'll be fine." "I'm not a ghost, Vance," David said, his voice dropping into that terrifyingly calm register that made corrupt men tremble. "I'm a father, and if they're hurting kids, tell the team to meet me at the airfield in an hour." He hung up. He hugged Aria, holding her tight. "Study hard," he whispered. "Get them," she whispered back. David Sterling turned and walked toward the elevator. The retirement would have to wait. The wolf was back on the hunt. And that is the story of how a corrupt system tried to silence a girl, only to be dismantled by the one man they shouldn't have messed with. It's a brutal reminder that justice might be slow, but when it hits hard. Reynolds lost his freedom, Hayes lost his dignity, and Aria found her voice to change the world. What do you think? Did the officers get what they deserved, or was 45 years too harsh? Let me know your verdict in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story, where we explore what happens when bullies pick the wrong victim. Share this video with someone who believes in karma. Thanks for watching, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.